From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my trusty co-host, David Feldman. Welcome back, David. How you doing?
Very good. Thank you, Steve.
And, of course, we also had the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. If you are tuning in for the first time, this is the program where David and I get to talk to Ralph about what's going on in America and the world. And in turn, Ralph introduces us to a wide variety of activists, authors, and academics who are out there in the trenches fighting the good fight on behalf of ordinary flesh and blood people, not corporations masquerading as people. And today's program is no different. Later in the show, we're going to be talking to Joan Claybrook, legendary activist, auto safety expert, and former president of Public Citizen. Basically, Joan is going to tell us about how there are certain people out there who don't care if you get hit by a truck, literally. But first, Ralph, introduce us to our first guest.
Thank you, Steve. David, our first guest is Fred Stokes, who I've been privileged to know for many years because he was the spark plug in setting up a group called Organization for Competitive Markets, or OCM for short, representing small family farms against a double pressure, the pressure from giant suppliers of seed and fertilizer and so on, and giant buyers who squeeze the small farmer and the rancher mercilessly. And Fred started OCM, and I was happy to be in at the founding in October 1998. There are a group of small farmers and supporters of the small farm economy in this country, as well as some academics. They hold annual meetings. They have a wonderful newsletter, which we'll tell you how to get shortly. Fred comes from Mississippi. He grew up on a diversified family farm in east central Mississippi, and he spent a good number of years in the military around the Vietnam War. And he's come back and he said, hey, there's a national security problem here. These giant corporations are swallowing up the backbone of American agriculture, the small family farmer. So we're going to have a good discussion on this, but don't think it just applies to farmers. It applies to everything you eat, day in and day out. What kind of food you eat, what price you pay for the food you eat, how you can get and not get the food you want. And here we go. Thank you very much, Fred, for coming on.
Ralph, it is a privilege to be on this with you. Been a long-time admirer of you and your work.
Thank you, Fred. Let's get underway with, I want to tell you a little vignette. Back a few years ago, I was campaigning in southern Illinois with a couple of young people, and we were driving along a road where one little farm after another, separated by miles, with the white fence and the barn, would be seen. And I told them, I said, someday you're going to tell your grandchildren that there was a time when you were young when you actually saw small farms because they're being destroyed along with ranches. About 1,000 ranches a month are going out of business, for example, according to OCM, the Organization for Competitive Markets. Can you give city folk, and I say this because unless there's a greater unity between city folk and rural folk, these giant corporations are going to end up with a few horrendously big, vertically integrated agribusiness. People are not going to like it. Can you give a description of the central concerns of the Organization for Competitive Markets, Fred?
Well, Ralph, we view this as a malady we call chickenization. The contract poultry industry is a model that seems to be being used throughout all of agriculture, in which, as a friend of mine said years ago, the corporations don't own farms, they just own the farmer. And the farmer is being made into a menial, subservient, assembly line worker on the global food supply chain. And the independence of our farmers is rapidly disappearing. The family farm and family agriculture in general is disappearing, and in its place is the factory farm and contract agriculture, which is a subservient, demeaning process that destroys initiative and, I think, bodes ill for the future of farmers and for those who want to continue eating.
Describe the contract peonage with the chicken farmers. I think people will be pretty astounded to see what's going on there.
Those who have access to a computer want to do a Google, they should go to their search engine and Google Craig Watt. He's a very courageous contract poultry producer who spills the beans on that evil system, who tells people what that thing is all about. And then John Oliver did a very lighthearted, comical thing that had deeper meaning about the poultry industry. And Chris Leonard, who is a friend of mine, who wrote a book entitled The Meat Racket. All of these say a lot about this system of contract agriculture, which the trail was blazed by the poultry industry, and as far as I'm concerned, it's American version of feudalism.
Fred, describe, let's assume you're a chicken farmer in Delaware or Arkansas. You're trying to make a few bucks to feed your family, and along comes Tyson and Purdue, the giant buyer processors. What do they do, and what would they make you sign?
Well, first of all, the entire chicken industry is vertically integrated. Poultry producers today are essentially all under contract to companies such as Purdue and Tyson and Sanderson Farm and Pilgrim's Pride and the like. And the companies own the hatchery, they own the feed mill, they own the processing. The farmer, on the other hand, is obliged to provide the facilities to grow the chicken and the work. And the facilities are by far the most expensive component of the whole thing. And, of course, the farmer does the work.
Aren't most of these farmers from Southeast Asia? They barely speak English and are easily exploitable?
No, not. There are a few. The Hmong people have been into this thing, and they're being exploited. So I understand. I'm not that familiar with their situation, but my general understanding is they're being exploited just like everybody else. They were hungry. They saw what they imagined was an opportunity that wasn't quite what they expected it to be. This is servitude, plain and simple. It's spreading like wildfire. The swine industry, overnight, 90% of the independent hog producers in this country were brought under contract very similar to the chicken situation. And the beef industry, I have these yippee Marlboro cowboys all the time saying, well, you can't vertically integrate the cattle business. Well, of course you can. You've got three packers that have 84% of the market. When you control the market, you can make a guy do dipsy doodles.
Fred, name the packers.
Well, now you have JBS, which is the dominant global packer, which is a Brazilian company with a heavy involvement with the Brazilian government. You have Tyson and you have Cargill or XL. But those are the three major packers, but the big ones are JBS and Tyson, who bought IBP. And then the swine industry, people need to know that the largest by far, Smithfield Farms, has been purchased by the Chinese. And an active participant in the entity that bought the Smithfield Farms is the People's Republic of China. So it puts us in position of our companies having to compete against governments.
Now, Fred, most people don't know this. Let's say in the chicken industry, how much of these chicken farmers who raise the chickens and bear the burdens under this contract agriculture, this industrial agriculture with Purdue or Tyson Foods, do they make much more than a nickel a chicken after they're finished?
It used to be, I think it's generally about 5 cents a pound, but that's their share. The thing started off initially, Bill Heffernan, Dr. William Heffernan from the University of Missouri, did a study. It's been ongoing for about 30 years, and the initial contract producers did well. And then the companies who had them under contract realized the leverage that they had, and they started squeezing them. The contract producer today, and if people will watch the documentary about Craig Watts, which will be very revealing. Here is a farmer who gives it to you straight in a very understandable way. And in my view, this is an evil system that we do not want to visit on all of U.S. agriculture.
You've been very strong in demanding that the federal government enforce the Packers and Stockyard Act of 1921. Because what you're all about is breaking up these giant combines, both suppliers and buyers that are squeezing the family farm into penury, into servitude. Really, I mean, we're not exaggerating here. These contracts are medieval. They're complete one-sided contracts, and these chicken farmers have no freedom. They talk about freedom in Washington. What is the Packers and Stockyards Act, and to what degree is it being enforced, and what would you like to see done?
The Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921 is now on the pile of rubbish in history. It was gutted over time, and an attempt to revitalize this piece of legislation, which is called the Producer Protection Act, which was designed to protect producers, not consumers, because producers were being exploited by the meat packers back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The thing effectively has been gutted and nullified. A recent attempt to breathe life and meaning back into the act was defeated largely by the National Cattlemen's Association, National Cattlemen and Beef Association, which is supposed to be an arm of the cattlemen, which is supported with a checkoff that generates about $80 million a year, but which in fact is a total captive of the meat packers and does their bidding. And a classic example is this attempt of the so-called GIPSA rule, the Grain Inspection and Packers and Stockyards Administration, had a rule which would have put some teeth back into the Packers and Stockyards Act, which was defeated resoundingly because the organization that many cattlemen thinks represents their interests is in fact nothing but an arm of the meat packers. And so the $80 million a year or thereabouts, and collectively over the 30 years of the program, we spent a couple $1 billion, has been used to fund those who are opposed to the interest of the people who are mandated to pay this program, which is supposed to promote their product. And that continues, and we're trying to litigate to do something about it. But there again, the poor cowboy sitting out there is outgunned tremendously, and generally the apathy works against us. But
what was in the news, Fred, recently is exactly what you're talking about in terms of consequence. People go into supermarkets and they want to buy meat, and they want to buy where this meat comes from. And so there was a law passed that required what they call country of origin labeling. So if the meat comes from China, Mexico, Brazil, Canada, or U.S., people have a right to know. Well, this was brought up by one of our adversary imports, country, before the World Trade Organization, one of these repressive corporate-managed trade agreements that we and 180 other countries belong to. It was brought up before secret tribunals, literally, they are closed, in Geneva, Switzerland, and we lost about a month ago. And so Brazil and Mexico and others were preparing to fine us as much as $4 to $5 billion, paid for by the taxpayer, I suppose. And so already the Congress is caving. The House overwhelmingly repealed your right to know where your meat comes from, and now it's before the Senate. What's your view of all this?
Well, my view is that if you wanted proof positive that the people on Capitol Hill are bought and paid for, you have only to look at the overwhelming two-thirds of the members of the House of Representatives voted to repeal a law which, according to my information, 98% of the American people favor to nullify. So they would have it to where the best producers in the world producing the best product in the world to the best market in the world are prohibited from identifying and differentiating their product by some little third world group of folks who meet in secret and nullify the sovereignty of this country and our laws.
They may not have the same safety standards either, right?
Absolutely not. If people want to buy chicken from China or beef from Brazil or Argentina or wherever, fine. They ought to know what they're buying. I don't know of anybody that doesn't believe that you ought to have the ability to differentiate and choose. One needs to ask the question, what possible motivation can there be behind those who seek to nullify country of origin labeling and make it impossible for you to determine the country of origin from the food you're about to buy and consume?
And they didn't even have to use U.S. courts. They went to a secret tribunal in Geneva under the World Trade Organization. They have 3 judges who moonlight as corporate lawyers. There's no independent appeal, and our government lost that battle. And now Congress is getting on its knees and saying some secret tribunal in Geneva, petitioned by Brazil and Mexico, is going to reverse a consumer protection supported by 98% of the American people. You see, listeners, what we mean when we go after the Trans-Pacific Agreement, which is like even worse than the World Trade Organization, your medicine prices are going to go up and so on, is that they put trade above your consumer, labor, and environmental rights and force your labor, environmental, and consumer standards like country of origin to say that they're not impeding international trade. Instead of making trade adjust to consumer, environmental, worker, antitrust laws, it's just the reverse. That's why we call it a global corporate coup d'etat.
We have a government of corporations, not of the people. Corporations are now people, and their money is speech, and they just happen to have more money for speech than we have. So whose voice gets heard?
That's right.
And the trade is a perfect example. We're running trade deficits on the magnitude of 40 to 70 billion a year. I understand our cumulative trade deficit is something on the order of $7 trillion. We owe the Chinese more than $1 trillion, and that 40 to 70 billion dollars a year equals 10 million jobs at a wage of 40 or to 70 a year. It's insane.
Yeah, Fred, I think it's 400 to 700 billion dollars trade deficit.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I'm sorry. The other part of my math was right. It equals 10 million jobs at that figure. And the question is, whose interest are these people serving?
Well, let me ask you, Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack, Tom Vilsack, he came in, we thought he was going to be a bit of a reformer. Has he had any elbow room here under President Obama, or is it just the way it was under President Bush and
I can't
President
tell you
Clinton?
how bitterly disappointed I am with the Obama administration, and more specifically with the performance of Secretary Vilsack. We talked about this $80 million a year that is being raised by the beef checkoff. The contracting process for awarding the contract, which that $80 million, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association get about $50 million a year. That is the most blatant conflict of interest anyone can imagine. The entity that always gets the contract also controls the contracting process. And rather than recusing themselves, they use their control to award the contract to themselves. Secretary Vilsack is an attorney. We have met with him and pointed out this blatant conflict, which is prohibited, and yet he refuses to do anything about it. He could end this abuse of these funds and stop the process of producers funding their own demise summarily. He could do it tomorrow morning, but he refuses to do it.
For those of you who don't know about this checkoff, it's a certain amount of dollars per head of cattle, and it was designed to help cattle raisers, the ranchers, and what Fred is saying, it's been taken over by the packing industry. Fred, tell us what we can do to help the small farmer, and it's in our own interest as consumers. I mean, what they're doing to food, chemicalizing it and genetically engineering it and packing it with stuff that leaches and promoting it in ways that help these global corporations control us even more, and pushing away the great tradition of decentralized local agriculture where you can get your food supply not from thousands of miles away from people you've never seen, companies you've never reviewed. Tell us what we can do and how we can get in touch with the organization.
Is to join us August the 22nd at the Residence Inn, Airport Residence Inn in Kansas City, Missouri. OCM is having its annual meeting. We normally call it a conference, although this one is going to be a bit different. Over the 30 years or so I've been dabbling in this stuff, I look back and we've lost ground. We're worse off today than we were when we started. We had all sorts of meetings that informed people as to what the problem is, only to have the situation on the ground get continually worse. At this particular meeting, we're coming forward with specific recommendations as to how we address the situation. And one of the primary ways is to go to the court, to litigate. I understand the vast majority of people on Capitol Hill are bought. Judges are also bought, but probably fewer than some of those politicians. I think that our best promise is to litigate and compel folks to obey the law. Our antitrust laws are a joke. They're being ignored. You know this as well as other people. It's ridiculous.
Fred, in our concluding minutes, what do you think of the growth of farmer-to-consumer markets? There are over 8,000 of them all over the country.
I think that will probably affect 15, 20% at the most. But, Ralph, the guy that grows number 2 yellow corn or soybeans, the farmer out there, is entitled to fair play. And I want to include him in this thing, too. So
yes.
I think that branded products, for example, are a way to mitigate the effects of abolishing country of origin labeling. But it's not the same. I want to see a requirement that food products be identified as to where they came from so the consumer can make those choices. They don't want to just know the nutritional value and the dietary components and this sort of thing. They should have a right to know these things that may bear on food safety, and for that matter, it may bear on economic and job opportunity and this sort of thing. So,
Fred, let me ask you, what's the role of the big agricultural cooperatives here that the farmers established 100 years ago?
They're great. The Capra-Volstead Act's been around a long time, and it's been tried. But as we are here today, I don't know of a single big success that's been experienced. Farmland was a big cooperative that was blowing and going for a while, turned out to be very corrupt. I don't know. It's wonderful that the Congress saw fit to create a law to allow farmers to come together and form cooperatives and not have to worry about the antitrust laws and so forth. And the handful of entities that have come online and been successful have been bought out by the big corporations.
Well, Fred, we don't want to leave the listeners feeling the situation is hopeless, because once people in the cities and suburbs learn more about this and band together with the small farmer, it's going to become a formidable force. So tell the listeners how they can get the newsletter, how they can be part of the Organization for Competitive Markets on the behalf of the small farm economy in this country.
Well, they could go to our website, which is www.competitivemarkets.com, and you will find the email addresses and phone numbers, and the phone number of our secretary in Lincoln that will get you signed up for the newsletter and that sort of thing. Her name is Pat Craycraft, and her number is 402-416-5731. And you know, I think there is some hope out there, but it's getting less every day in my view. And it's time, if people want choice and they want to address these issues, they need to come online here and let's get something going, because from what I see right now, there's an awful lot of apathy out there.
Right on, Fred. The website, again, is competitivemarkets.com. We've been talking with the incomparable Fred Stokes, who started the Organization for Competitive Markets and who is as determined a person as I've ever met to break up these giant corporate combines, foreign and domestic, that are predating on consumers and farmers alike. I don't think most people know that the largest companies that are selling you beef, pork, and poultry in the U.S. are now foreign-owned. And I don't think they know that the food service monopoly is about to be approved in a merger between Sysco and U.S. Food Corporation. So the first step, folks, get informed, get aroused, and get involved. Thank you very much, Fred Stokes.
Thank you, Ralph. I appreciate it. Keep up the good work.
Always will. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
We've been talking to farm activist Fred Stokes, one of the founders of the Organization for Competitive Markets. Go to competitivemarkets.com for more information. And by the way, the documentary that Fred was referring to about North Carolina contract farmer Craig Watts is called Cockfight. Meet the farmer who blew the whistle on Big Chicken. That's from Fusion TV. Apparently it's available online. When we come back, we're going to talk to legendary activist and auto safety expert Joan Claybrook about what might be lurking out there on the roads. Don't go away.
The Ralph Nader Radio Hour is a weekly series where we get to discuss with Ralph Nader what's happening in Washington,
What's happening around the world, and most importantly, what's underneath it all.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm David Feldman along with Steve Scrovan and, of course, Ralph Nader. If you have missed any of this as a radio broadcast, you can find us as a podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, RalphNaderRadioHour.com, Nader.org, or Ralph's Facebook page. And don't forget to pick up a copy of Ralph's latest book, Return to Sender, Unanswered Letters to the President. Former U.S. Secretary of Labor Robert Reich said of Return to Sender, for half a century, Ralph Nader has said what he thinks, written what he believes, and told it like it is, even to presidents. Too bad they don't write back. I'd love to know how they'd explain themselves to Ralph and to the American people. So pick up a copy of Return to Sender wherever fine books are sold. Steve?
Thanks, David. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce you to someone I've actually gotten to know over the past few years. When Joan Claybrook was the president of Public Citizen, she enticed me to become a board member, which is my way of saying this lady has cost me a lot of money. People, this is what I want to say. If there were a Hall of Fame for public interest advocates, she would most certainly be a charter member. A longtime colleague of Ralph's, Joan was there alongside him for the very early battles to enact all of the auto safety laws we as a society now take for granted. During the Carter administration, she was the head of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, commonly known as NHTSA. She oversaw Public Citizen for over a quarter of a century. And I am pleased to welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ms. Joan Claybrook. Welcome, Joan.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome, Joan. We're going to talk about something that's in most people's rear view mirror as they're driving on highways throughout the country, and that is these giant trucks that Congress is pushing under the lobbying power of the trucking industry to make even bigger trucks. 4,000 people are killed every year, and 100,000 Americans are seriously injured in truck crashes annually. That's a lot of people. They have enormous economic costs, close to $100 billion a year, in crashes involving commercial motor vehicles. The heat is on in Congress. Joan and others have been battling the trucking industry. And Joan, explain to our listeners what the situation is here on Capitol Hill, because it's imminent, it's urgent. And let me tell you, when they hear from motorists back home, bicyclists back home, motorcyclists back home, they'll listen. So we're going to give you phone numbers and contact numbers for this urgent effort. Joan, take it away.
What's happening on Capitol Hill is that the trucking industry is using its money clout and its employment clout to get bigger trucks authorized by the Congress. Specifically, UPS and FedEx have been pressing really hard to get longer trailers these double trailers that are pulled by these big trucks. And they would increase by 10 more feet so that the truck would be about the equivalent of an 8-story building traveling along the highway. The bill that is being pushed is an appropriations bill. They're doing it on the Appropriations Committee because none of the Appropriations Committee members know anything about trucks, and they're not doing it on the Transportation Committee because they know they couldn't do it. They couldn't be successful. So what's happened is that the House of Representatives has already passed the legislation, and it's now pending in the Senate, so we're focusing all of our energy and concerns in the United States Senate. And the first step is going to be on the Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation. And the key members of that committee on the Democratic side are Senator Reed of Rhode Island. He's a longtime member of Congress. And Jack Reed is someone who should be sympathetic, and we need his help. Also, we're getting some help from Senator Leahy, who's done a great job of informing members of Congress of the problems. So these longer trucks, they're not allowed in 39 states. This legislation would force those states to allow them, preempt those states. And the best news that we've had recently is that 15 trucking companies, some big ones, like J.B. Hunt, that many people have heard of, have come out against this legislation. And they just wrote a letter to Thad Cochran, who's the chair of this Appropriations Committee, and to Barbara Mikulski, who is the ranking Democrat on the committee. And they said this measure would have a negative impact on highway safety, accelerate wear and tear on the nation's highway system, and make it very difficult for small trucking companies, which are the heart of our industry, to compete. And there has not been a sufficient dialogue around this measure to truly understand its consequences. So what's happened is that there haven't been any public hearings on this issue. The citizens have not had a chance to come in and testify. It's been like a backroom deal. And so some trucking companies finally have realized that this is a really terrible situation for them. And so they have come public, which is very rare. An industry would have a fight within itself. There are two other provisions in this bill that are terrible. One is sponsored by a senator from Maine, Susan Collins, and she is the best friend of the trucking industry, the best friend they ever had. And she's the chair of the subcommittee. And she is pushing to have truck drivers be required to work and drive 82 hours a week. That's what she is doing, 82 hours a week.
That's incredible. And that's why sleepy truckers are the cause of many of these horrendous crashes. Now, let's say she's on this program and you ask her the question, are you out of your mind, Senator Susan Collins from Maine, Republican? How can anybody drive 82 hours a week? What would she say?
She says that this is their usual way of working and that they know how to do it and they're very skilled and they get plenty of time off, which is a lie. What they get off is we get a weekend off of 48 hours. They get 34 hours. They get less time off. They never get paid overtime. They have to drive 11 hours a day, and they have to work an additional 3 hours a day for which they do not even get paid. And the way they calculate their time off and time on, she has recalculated it. It's complicated, but instead of having to drive 70 hours a week, which is the current rule, which is outrageous in itself, she's increasing it to 82 hours a week.
Where are the railroads on this? They should be opposed to this.
Well, some railroads are opposed to it, particularly the short line railroads, but unfortunately there's been a lot of mixing of the industry between the railroads and the trucking industry, and so the railroads, always afraid of the trucking industry, have not played a very strong role. They've done some work, but not a lot. The short line railroads have been much more aggressive, and of course now some of the smaller trucking companies are more aggressive, and the reason why is this, that if you increase the trailer length from 28 feet to 33 feet, which is what this bill would do, it would mean that the big boys can afford to buy new trailers and carry more cargo. But the regular companies and the smaller companies don't have the resources to do that. And so they're going to be at a competitive disadvantage. And in addition, in terms of intermodal transportation, often these truck trailers box is put directly on railroad cars. And those railroad cars are designed for 28-foot boxes. And they're not designed for 33-foot boxes. So the railroads would have to invest in all new cars that were going to be able, that would, if they were able to transport these 33-foot trailers. Increasing the length by 5 feet has huge consequences for the other members of this industry and, of course, for the railroads particularly.
It also beats up on the roads, which people experience. Talk about how these bigger trucks cause serious safety problems on state and local roads.
Well, they do, because these trucks are going to be heavier. They're going to be harder to stop. They're going to be harder to get on and off the ramps because they won't have the same kind of turning capacity. So they run over the sides of the cement and then destroy it. They're terrible for bridges. Bridges are in terrible disrepair, both on state and local and on federal roads. And there's a huge backlog of repairs needed for both the roads and the bridges. And these heavier trucks would just exacerbate all of that. And they wouldn't pay any more on their highway taxes through their gasoline use or fuel use because they'd have these longer trailers. So the big companies, a few big companies would have a big benefit, and everyone else would be disadvantaged. And we already have a terrible death and injury rate. When there's a crash between a big truck and a passenger motor vehicle, regular car, the 96% of the time, the people either injured or killed, and mostly killed, are the passengers in the vehicles, the cars, and not the truckers.
Are any of these trucks going to be coming in from Mexico, and are trucks from Mexico subject to the same inspections as American trucks?
Yes, the Mexican trucks have exactly the same requirements as U.S. trucks. And yes, there will be trucks coming in from Mexico like this. Now, that's the third provision in this bill, which is really a problem when you have Mexican trucks coming in, because there's a provision in federal law for a minimum insurance amount of $750,000, which doesn't begin to cover the costs of a truck crash. And it hasn't been changed since 1985. And this bill, this legislation we're talking about, would freeze it at that number, $750,000, despite the fact that the Department of Transportation has been working for 5 years to come up with a rulemaking that would increase that number to something that's much more rational in today's dollars. And so Mexican trucks would only have to insure for $750,000, and they could do millions and millions of dollars worth of damage. Now, that happens in the United States as well, but often in the United States you can go after other assets of the trucking company. For Mexican trucks, that'd be extremely expensive and difficult to do, and to go to Mexico and sue. So that provision particularly affects Mexican trucks.
So these trucking companies have limited their liability, and they're not required to pay the full amount under a frozen insurance policy. Oh, this is secret legislation. I heard from people on Capitol Hill that the trucking industry lobbyists and their congressional allies are really saying, let's get this through in a quick way with no hearings before the American people, the American motorists find out about it. Because if they ever find out about it and they flood the congressional switchboard with outraged phone calls, the ball game is over for the trucking industry, for FedEx and UPS. And so give our listeners the switchboard number for Congress, indicate what senators they should focus on right now. You can really turn this around, people, and get your friends who are looking in their rearview mirror rather fearfully these days when these giant trucks come on them.
The switchboard number to get hold of any member of Congress, you can just call this one number and it'll go to any member of Congress. You just ask for them, is 202-224-3121. That's 202-224-3121. Now, the key decision makers in the Senate right now at the committee level, which is where this bill is, are Thad Cochran of Mississippi and the chair of the Transportation Commission in Mississippi is infuriated about this legislation, has made his views well known, and is now going public all over the place in opposition. They do not want these bigger trucks in Mississippi. And so Thad Cochran is a real possibility if we can put enough pressure on him from people in Mississippi to let them know that they do not want these larger trucks, just like the chair of the Transportation Commission does not.
The chair of the Transportation Commission, who's blowing the whistle from Mississippi, is going nationwide, and he is going for bear, and he is a right-wing conservative, right?
That's right. Very conservative, very big in the Republican Party in Mississippi.
The Senate is structured in a way where if you can get Senator Cochran and a couple other senators to oppose this, it's all over. We win. The motorists win. The trucking industry loses. So who are the other senators that should be called to switchboard number 202-224-3121?
Well, I would say that another one is Senator Boozman, Boozman of Arkansas, because J.B. Hunt, which is the biggest trucking company in Arkansas, has come out against this legislation. And I think that Senator Boozman would be hard put to vote for it, given the fact that the biggest trucking company in his state, his relatively small state, is opposed to it. So I think that that's another very important member to get in touch with, Senator Boozman. There's another trucking company called U.S. Truck that's located in Arkansas that's opposed as well, and a third one called PAM Transport in Arkansas. So there's a lot of opposition in Arkansas, in the trucking industry itself, to this legislation. I think that Senator Collins of Maine is also quite vulnerable on this, because tired truckers are really disliked, and they do cause up to 40% of the fatal crashes, according to the National Transportation Safety Board.
These are truckers who fall asleep at the wheel, and the leading advocate against tired truckers is a mother who lost her children in a sleep truck crash in Maine. What's the name of that group?
Mothers Against Tired Truckers, and she is in Maine, and she is furious at Collins for doing this. And I think that Collins is very vulnerable on this because Maine is a moderately progressive state, and people don't want tired truckers, truck drivers that are driving these huge trucks and fall asleep and then just run over people. So that's another very important member of the United States Senate, and she's chair of the subcommittee.
The other high-profile case that people might know is the case of SNL and 30 Rock comedian Tracy Morgan, who was hit by his car. His limo, which is not a small car, was hit by a tired trucker driving a Walmart truck. One of the passengers was killed. Well over a year later, he is still recovering. So people might remember that. This is what kind of brings that home, too.
Tracy Morgan he has been a very important story to tell about the terrible consequences when the truck driver falls asleep and runs right over your vehicle, and that's what happened there. So this is a really horrendous thing. I would say that another senator who's very, very important is Senator Kirk. He's also on the subcommittee. He's from Illinois. The Illinois legislature just passed a resolution in the Illinois Senate opposing this bill, and they also have had a huge increase in deaths from big trucks recently in Illinois. And the public opinion in Illinois, a poll just came out where they're vehemently opposed to increase the truck size and weight. And in Illinois, between 2012 and 2013, the fatalities increased by 13% from tractor-trailer crashes in Illinois. And from 2009 to 2013, there was an increase of almost 600 deaths. I mean, there were almost 600 deaths in Illinois.
Nationwide.
And Senator Kirk is reputed to be friendly with Fred Smith, who is the head of FedEx. And so it's really important for the people of Illinois to let Kirk know if you do not want these larger trucks in Illinois. And right now the state does not permit them.
Where's the Obama administration on this?
They're opposed to it. They said they might even veto the bill. So they also just released a statement. They've been doing a study for 2 years on larger trucks, and the trucking industry was sending out a rumor that they were going to find larger trucks were okay, which is 100% the opposite. They just came out with a statement saying that there is not enough data to justify any increase in large trucks. And so the trucking industry is furious about that. They're furious about these independent trucking companies coming out against the bill. And this legislation is going to move in the next couple of days. So it's really, really urgent. It'll probably be early next week. And so it's urgent for people to get in touch with their senators and members of Congress. And so I think I've mentioned some of the really, really key members of the subcommittee. I would say that Richard Shelby of Alabama, is probably the person who is the biggest advocate for the trucking industry, rather than Senator Collins. And so Shelby of Alabama is pushing this really hard, and I think is going to do it. The other senator who may get some opposition from doing this is Capito from West Virginia. She's pushing this also. Her name is Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia.
You have your marching orders, listeners. Just weigh in on this, and if you have to make one or two calls, focus on Senator Cochran of Mississippi. Joan, one last quick question. You're on the highway, and there's a double trailer behind you, pretty closely behind you. Suddenly, you see something that requires and sudden braking on your part, does that double trailer have braking power equivalent to yours in terms of the number of feet to stop your car?
Oh, absolutely not. The trucks with the double trailers take hundreds of feet longer to stop than a car. And that's one of the great problems with them, is that they can't stop. They travel with regular cars, but they cannot stop as fast. They can't maneuver as well. If it's a very windy day, the trailers start to wiggle and come over into your lane. They can't get off the highway the way they're designed in many cases, and they can't stop. And if the truck driver falls asleep or dozes off, and many of them have admitted in a recent study that they do that all the time because they're very tired, then a nanosecond is too much time to be asleep when you're driving one of these big trucks. So the number to call is 202-224-3121, and contact your senators, whether they're on the committee or not. Definitely contact Senator Thad Cochran of Mississippi, who's the chair of the committee, Barbara Mikulski, who is the ranking Democrat on the full committee, and Senator Reed of Rhode Island, Jack Reed, who is the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee. And I would definitely contact Boozman and Kirk as well, Kirk from Illinois and Boozman from Arkansas.
Very good. Thank you very much, Joan Claybrook. Unlike other complex issues, everybody understands this danger when they hit the highway. And once people show that they know what's going on in secret in the Senate, all hell will break loose, and the senators will run for cover, even if the trucking industry owns them. Thank you very much, Joan Claybrook.
We've been talking to legendary activist and auto safety expert Joan Claybrook. Call your senators and representatives to stop the trucking industry from putting these enormous trucks with tired drivers on our highways. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll get to some of your Facebook questions. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, nader.org. Sign up for Ralph's weekly newsletter by going to nader.org. And if you would like to have your questions answered on this program, please like the Ralph Nader Facebook page, and then you can ask Ralph questions and he'll answer those questions, like this one from Eric Anders Nielsen. He says, Ralph, I supported you and voted for you for president. I've heard you've suggested that Rand Paul should be president. I'm completely against this if it's true. Is this the case? And if so, why?
No, I didn't do that. I like Rand Paul's position on the notorious Patriot Act. I like his opposition to bailing out Wall Street and corporate welfare. And I like his criticism of empire abroad. But he's dead set against full Medicare for all. He doesn't like health and safety regulation. So I pick and choose when I comment on presidential candidates. I say approving statements when they do the right thing and opposing statements when they don't do the right thing. I have not endorsed Rand Paul for president.
Is there anybody you're eyeing?
No, you're the last person I'd tell you that.
It's Trump. It's Trump, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's Trump.
We'll get to Trump. Trump is worth a segment, believe me.
Oh, yeah. Have you had any personal dealings with him?
Donald Trump is the Republican presidential nominee's worst nightmare. They're probably flipping over now, learning that he's going to go into the presidential race, spending endless money with his wild flamboyance and his circus-like atmosphere. And he will burlesque the Republican side of the presidential contest. And that is bad news for the Republicans.
Yeah, Karl Rove recently referred to him as an idiot and a moron. So
I'm worried they're going to find something clean on him.
That will be the big scandal.
He wants to expand how much he's worth. And he says he's worth $9 to $10 billion, but he's all assets and no liability. There are some specialists who think he's worth under $1 billion. So you imagine somebody who wants to try to be richer than he is. So he's going to be real problems for people like Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and Governor Kasich and Governor Walker in a bad way. He's going to be a real problem of burlesquing, making the whole process look ridiculous.
Well, in the meat industry, we have a saying for somebody like Donald Trump. He's all toupee and no cattle.
Let's get to our next question, Ralph.
See if
David
Ralph is is Ralph still there?
I don't think he hung up on you on that joke.
Okay.
David Groves asks, do you support fusion energy like ITER project in South France?
No way. The best fusion energy comes from the sun. It's going to be around for 4 billion years. Solar energy in all its manifestations is expanding all over the world, including wind power and solar panels. We don't need another concentrated form of nuclear fusion energy, especially since the taxpayers in the U.S. have been funding research projects since the 1950s on fusion energy, and they haven't been able to come up with anything that comes close to a successful, commercially applicable experiment.
Everybody who is for nuclear power always points to France as if that is a very successful program over there. And do we know what's actually happening in France? Have there been leaks, spills, consequences? Because I don't hear that.
It's a very secretive industry regulated by a very secretive government under French law. They don't have a freedom of information law over there. About 75% of their energy comes from nuclear power. Just one major meltdown, and a lot of France will be uninhabitable, as was the case around Chernobyl. So the French should emulate the Germans, who are going renewable and efficiency and are closing down their nuclear plants.
Christina Antonio Mazzocchi writes, Ralph Nader, where do you see the labor movement heading?
Well, I see it heading down if they don't fund thousands of organizers which started labor unions in the first place. There are millions and millions of people who want to join labor unions, according to polls, including in the service industry. The union SEIU is organizing people in the service industry, but they haven't cracked McDonald's or Walmart or Target yet. But that's where the future is going to be for unionization in the USA.
Well, thank you for your questions. We're going to refresh that page and give you another chance to ask a whole new round of questions. We've come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I want to thank our guest, Fred Stokes of the Organization for Competitive Markets, and auto safety expert Joan Claybrook. On behalf of David Feldman, my name is Steve Scrovan. Talk to you next week, Ralph.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, David. And let's expand this program on more radio stations. Talk it up, folks, and download it as a podcast.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Thieves in the temple, too much money changing hands. It's really very simple. Just make a list of demands. We demand freedom. We demand equality. We demand justice. It ain't gonna happen until folks like you and me just stand up. Well, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, stand up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Well, tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you. Listen to me, people. Do you understand? We gotta stand up. Oh, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, step up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, you should. Oh, step up. Step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up. Rise up and take on the power. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, stand up. Oh, step up. Step up. You ought to step up. Rise up. Rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. I think you should step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, stand up. Step up. Step up. I think you should step up. Rise up. And you rise up because you have the power. Stand up. Hey, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Stand up. You step up. Step up. I think that we all should rise up. And you rise up. And you rise up. Stand up. And you rise up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up.